Excellencies, distinguished delegates, friends from the diplomatic corps, the media and think tanks, colleagues from the Government of India, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to speak to you today. I propose to look at India's opportunities for enhancing its engagement with Latin America and the various factors that affect our capacity to do so. Let me start by making an assertion. I will then go on to explore the various facets of this assertion. The relationship between India and Latin America is perhaps one of the most consequential, underdeveloped partnerships. Despite sharing structural similarities as large, resource-rich, demographically dynamic, developing economies, the two regions have remained, as described by the Brazilian presidential advisor, Celso Amorim, geographically distant but spiritually close, a formulation that captures both the promise and the persistent gap in actual engagement. The macroeconomic rationale for intensified India-Latin America engagement rests largely on complementarity, notwithstanding some elements of competition. Latin America's comparative advantage lies overwhelmingly in natural resources. Hydrocarbons, critical minerals, agricultural commodities, complementarities in seasons, and biodiversity-linked sectors, while India's strengths are concentrated in technology services, pharmaceuticals, manufactured goods, and an increasingly sophisticated financial sector enhanced by DPI strengths. This is therefore not a relationship of symmetrical rivalry, but one that has significant areas of structural fit. The lithium triangle of Argentina, Bolivia, and Chile holds approximately 60% of the world's known lithium reserves, a resource now central to the energy transition and emerging technologies. The mineral-intensive nature of AI data centers, battery storage, and clean energy infrastructure means that securing stable, diversified supply chains is critical to avoiding bottlenecks. As India seeks to reduce its dependence on Chinese supply chains for critical minerals, a goal elevated by both strategic anxiety and the imperatives of its production-linked incentive schemes, Latin America presents a viable and politically neutral alternative. Let me just briefly touch upon the current state of the India-Latin America relationship. Bilateral trade between India and Latin America and the Caribbean is nearing about $50 billion, a figure that sounds substantial until one benchmarks it against the region's trade with China, which exceeds $500 billion annually. Latin America is a large and substantial market of 19 countries, a population of 680 million, and GDP of nearly $7 trillion. The population is comparable to ASEAN, but the combined GDP is significantly larger. India was the 7th largest supplier of goods to Latin America, accounting for over $20 billion in 2024. But this is just 1.4% of Latin America's total imports of 1.4 trillion. Inside these broad figures are hidden some interesting insights. For example, India's exports to Brazil, accounting for about $6.7 billion, are higher than those to several traditional trade partners, such as Japan, South Korea, or Vietnam, and also other regional partners such as Sri Lanka, Indonesia, or Thailand. And India's exports to Mexico, accounting for about $5.75 billion, are more than our exports to Russia, Canada, or Egypt. India is also the 5th largest destination for Latin America's exports after US, China, Canada, and Spain, and figuring above Germany, UK, France, or Japan. Nevertheless, India's share of Latin American trade remains below 3%. Empirical analysis consistently identify logistics costs, inadequate preferential trade agreements, paucity of institutional arrangements, and low bilateral awareness among business communities as the primary structural impediments. tariff structures in both regions prioritize and protect domestic producers, limiting market access. Regulatory divergence, though decreasing, still creates compliance complexities for firms seeking market entry. Language and cultural familiarity barriers, while surmountable, require intentional investment in business facilitation and personnel exchange programs. Foreign direct investment flows from India to Latin America have intensified, though they remain concentrated in some sectors. Indian pharmaceutical companies have established substantial manufacturing and distribution networks, capitalizing on generic medicine demand and growing regulatory familiarity. Information technology and business process management represent increasingly attractive sectors. Indian IT firms such as TCS and Wipro have built meaningful presences in Brazil, Mexico, and Uruguay. Latin America's digital transformation agenda and growing technology adoption will create more openings for software development, cloud services, and AI-enabled solutions. Yet, these remain isolated vectors rather than a coordinated investment strategy. Brazil and Argentina are India's strategic partners in the region, with whom we engage in a broad range of areas such as defense, space, healthcare, nuclear energy, trade, and technology. Recent Indian policy has explicitly framed Latin America as a new geography for critical minerals partnerships, with Argentina and Chile emerging as pivotal lithium partners and Peru and Chile important for copper offtake agreements. Ongoing FTA negotiations with Peru and Chile now explicitly seek a chapter on critical minerals. In addition, establishing financial instruments facilitating bilateral commerce, including rupee-denominated trade settlements and specialized credit facilities, can reduce transaction costs and currency risks, encouraging increased trade volumes. Friends, China's economic footprint in Latin America is an order of magnitude larger than India's and is built on trade dominance, big-ticket infrastructure, and policy bank finance. Though large-scale BRI lending has largely moderated, China remains the dominant extra-hemispheric actor in trade, critical minerals, and infrastructure, and has used this leverage to widen diplomatic recognition and strategic influence. On the other hand, India's presence is diffuse, more market-driven, and is oriented towards services, soft power, and selective sectoral investments, as I had mentioned earlier. Its strengths lie in demand-driven commerce, absence of debt-linked conditionalities, and a benign image as a democratic, non-hegemonic partner, features that contrast positively with regional concerns about the environmental and governance impacts of BRI projects. Yet, this benign perception is not enough to compensate for structural weaknesses: limited high-level visits, no ambitious FTA in South America beyond narrow PTAs with Mercosur and Chile, and serious logistics constraints owing to lack of direct sea and air connectivity. The result is that India is respected and welcomed, but not yet seen as a systemic economic player in Latin America. Our diplomatic presence in Latin America is increasing, with new missions in Paraguay, Bolivia, and Ecuador, and one soon to come up in Uruguay. But to realize the full potential of its opportunities, India will need to scale up and systematize its engagement through a deliberate strategy to reduce trade and logistics costs, give firms predictable market access through more trade agreements, such as upgrading PTAs with Mercosur, fast-tracking FTAs with Peru and Chile, and exploring FTAs or early harvest deals with other countries in the region, and also stronger development partnerships. India's emergence as a leader in affordable technology solutions and frugal innovation presents a particular resonance with Latin American development priorities and fiscal challenges. Unlike China's emphasis on capital-intensive infrastructure, resource extraction, and commodity sourcing, India can position itself as a technology and knowledge partner, appealing to Latin American governments seeking development pathways beyond commodity dependence. Heightened US-China rivalry and US reassertion of Latin America as its own hemisphere makes strategic diversification a more urgent imperative for Latin America, but also more delicate. Latin American actors may consciously look for partners that are big enough to matter, but also not so big as to dominate. India fits that sweet spot as a benign, development-focused partner committed to strengthening the voice of the Global South, but we also have to be nimble and scale up quickly enough to be economically relevant. India will also have to practice a calibrated approach seen as enhancing, not undermining, regional autonomy. The US is also likely to push for friend-shoring supply chains. Some of this could intersect with India's own ambitions. If managed well, this could make India-LAC value chains more attractive by anchoring them in US-facing production networks. Any move in sensitive sectors such as defense, ports, telecom, dual-use infrastructure, etc., will be scrutinized through a geopolitical lens in Washington. Rather than trying to compete with US or Chinese scale across the board, India could identify a handful of flagship corridors such as green energy, critical minerals, digital governance, technology, health, etc., and invest adequate political capital to make them exemplars of equitable South-South cooperation. To sum up, most academic literature on India-Latin America relations appears to converge on a common diagnosis. The partnership is structurally logical and diplomatically warm, but underdeveloped in real practice. The correction requires not just political will, but a sophisticated multi-instrument strategy that combines greater trade facilitation, investment promotion, digital cooperation, and enhanced people-to-people linkages. In a world where supply chain diversification, multipolarity, and energy transition are reshaping global economic geography, India and Latin America are distant but natural partners. It is a big opportunity that is crying for attention. Thank you very much.